This is going to be a fun one. It involves politics, religion, and opium.
Moses Thatcher was an apostle. He's called to the Quorum of the 12 in 1879.
One of the greatest controversies in our church's history.
Thatcher chooses to affiliate with the Democratic Party.
But local church/political leaders feared that national party divisions would weaken the local community.
And the Liberal Party argued that the church exercised excessive control.
Republicans were openly leading a crusade against plural marriage at this time.
Like in one speech given in 1892, he supposedly declared that Jesus Christ would have been a Democrat and Lucifer would have been a Republican.
Comparing Republicans to Satan didn't really help to cool things down.
And he felt like, oh, the church doesn't have any right to tell me what to do.
Dr. Parkinson told John Henry Smith that Thatcher is a morphine fiend, the only apostle drug addict in our church's history.
People inside and outside the church had a lot of questions. It was no mistake.
The Moses Thatcher story is kind of the first in a trilogy.
Hello, Scott.
Hello, Casey.
Nice to see you once again. And for those of you that don't know, I record in Provo in my office, and Scott records in Rexburg in a cabinet under the stairs. So you're like a Harry Potter type figure or something like that.
I have a lot of connections with Harry Potter. I live in the cabinet under the stairs. That's where my office is. That's actually true. That's where I'm recording, coming at you live from the cabinet under the stairs.
And you used to have a home office, but you are a good parent and you gave it up for one of your kids or something, didn't you?
Yeah. Well, my son went on his mission, so his room was available for 2 years. Used his room, and now but I don't know. I don't know if people want to know all that. I would like the image in their mind that we're sitting in this really fancy studio, Casey, and we're we got this overlook over the city and super fancy equipment everywhere. That's the image that we're going for. So I think you just popped the bubble.
Well, and I am sitting in my office, which, it's kind of the pecking order where I work, that if you have windows in your office, you've sort of made it. But I got windows in my office, and then the Scripture Central crew immediately came in and said, we need to black out those windows. So they put up these big curtains so that lighting isn't as much of an issue. The whole reason why I bring this up is we don't get to see each other in person a lot, but we will be together in a couple weeks, correct?
That's right. Yeah, we're doing a little Education Week series at BYU Provo, and we get to teach together on stage. Casey, that's always a blast to be with you in that setting, man.
Yeah, and it's super fun to get a chance to interact and to also be around a lot of people that listen to the podcast, or people who might not be familiar with what we do. So we just wanted to put in a little plug. We're going to be at Education Week in Provo, and we're going to be doing sort of a greatest hits of Church History Matters, where we're going to be talking about several topics that we've covered in the podcast, but live and in person and together.
So if you're available and you want to come see us, we'd love to meet you in person. Come up, say hi. We never know who's listening to this. And so it's always a delight to be able to meet you out in the wild. So please come on over, say hi. BYU Provo. Where are we? What's the dates? It's like August 18th through the 21st or something.
I think that's right.
Anyway.
And we're going to be mostly in the music building. There's a brand new music building on BYU campus. We're in the concert hall. And I'm doing a Monday thing solo in the ballroom of the Wilkinson Center. But everybody, we'd love to meet you in person. We'd love to say hi. Yeah. Scott, I know you make a considerable sacrifice because you're away from your family for a few days to do this, but it's just a real pleasure to get to interact in person.
It's a fun tradition. Yeah. We're in the music building, and I think, Casey, aren't you going to be singing as part of...
Well, I don't want to spoil the surprise, aren't you going to be dancing? Aren't you doing like an interpretive dance while I sing or something?
You know
like
what?
That?
We're just going to let that linger in the air, and why don't you guys just come and find out?
Yeah, no spoilers. Let's get to what we're talking about today, which this week we're continuing our series on the church and politics, but we're going to make a little bit of a time leap from our previous episodes.
Yeah. In our first episode, so we talked about Latter-day Saints' belief about the United States Constitution. And we made the case that while the Revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants declare pretty clearly that the Constitution contains inspired principles, many early Latter-day Saints were dissatisfied with the execution of those principles, right? And it was a dissatisfaction born not from listening to a lecture on political theory at a university, but from their own painful, brutal experience being violently expelled from Missouri in 1838, right? And this led to what we talked about then in episode 2.
Yes, that's right. A direct result of the Saints' dissatisfaction with the federal government was the 1844 presidential campaign of Joseph Smith, where he clearly and on many occasions directly stated that the Constitution was inspired, but he thought the government of the United States was led by opportunistic men who refused to protect the rights and privileges of people laid out in the Constitution.
That's right. And when we spoke with Derek Sainsbury a couple episodes ago, he said that Joseph Smith was not just a protest candidate, but that the Saints, many of them actually felt that Joseph had a genuine chance to win the presidency, although they believed it would take a little divine intervention for that to happen. But as we know, Joseph's candidacy was brought to a tragic halt when he became the first major presidential candidate to be assassinated.
And before he's killed, though, he does bring two words into our vocabulary that we should be familiar with. One is theocracy, and one is aristarchy. And theocracy was a variation on democracy, where people were ultimately ruled by God and Jesus Christ, but also served alongside them as part of the government. And aristarchy is almost the exact opposite of the close-sounding word aristocracy, where leaders are chosen under aristarchy because of their good character and their ability, and not because of their family lines, which is aristocracy. So, again, it's a meritocracy, to throw another word into the mix, where the best people are chosen, but they're chosen by revelation and with input from God, and the whole system depends on people being moral and upright.
Yeah, and the Saints sought to live out these ideals in practice to some extent, at least, after they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley and they began to settle the Intermountain West, right? Like, for example, during roughly the first 10 years or so in Salt Lake, Brigham Young is going to wear 3 different hats simultaneously. He's got the prophet hat, he's got the governor hat, and then he's got the superintendent of Indian Affairs hat. And what's a little ironic about Brigham Young's political roles in Utah is that they actually thrust the Saints back into the politics of the United States, which is what they had made such great efforts to leave. And, you know, if we're being real frank, one of the most controversial episodes in our church's history played out in early Utah as Brigham Young acted in these 3 capacities simultaneously during the 1852 Utah Territorial Legislative Session.
That is correct. Yeah, we had a great conversation in our last episode with Paul Reeve, who walked us through his new research that showed the complexity of the issues the Saints were facing during that legislative session. And remember, they're trying to gain statehood for Utah in a pre-Civil War context, which meant navigating the almost impossible task of pleasing both the slave states and the free states so as to not upset the balance of power. And in the end, their attempts to do this led to, mixed results.
Yeah, on the one hand, they concluded in that legislative session that Utah would be a slave territory. But they didn't want to be Southern States-style slave territory. So they reject outright the concept of chattel slavery, where slaves had no rights whatsoever. They advocated for what they called a benevolent type of servitude. It's a quasi-indentured servitude where slave owners were required to treat their servants kindly. They were, for instance, legally forbidden from abusing their slaves, and they were required to provide education for them, as well as to gain their consent before they were sold or traded or transported out of Utah territory. And they also instituted a sort of gradual emancipation clause, which dictated that the children of enslaved people would not inherit the status of their parents. The intent being to gradually phase out and eliminate servitude over time. But of course, all of these points would become moot 10 years later in 1862, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Territorial Slavery Act into law, which freed all slaves and involuntary servants in U.S. territories. And so that was that, right? I mean, this whole slavery debate was behind them now, and they could move on, and nothing from these meetings would linger in the church for over 100 more years. Correct, Casey?
Well, yeah, we wish, but no. Unfortunately, while he was delivering a few speeches to that 1852 legislative session, advocating for this newer type of slavery in Utah, Brigham Young advanced the theory that people of African ancestry could not be ordained to the priesthood or receive the higher ordinances of the temple because of their lineage, which he declared was the divinely cursed lineage of Cain and Ham. Thankfully, back in 2013, the church clarified the issue in a gospel topics essay on the subject, and this is what they said. This is the quote: "Today, the church disavows the theories advanced in the past that black skin is a sign of divine disfavor or curse." End of quote. In fact, this essay goes on to reject all theological explanations that proliferated in attempts to explain or defend the racial ban in the church.
But after those speeches in 1852, the damage had been done to a major extent, right? Like, the Utah governor / church president had spoken. And so over the next half century or so, this curse of Cain idea would become so entrenched that church leaders will make it actual policy to ban anyone with black African blood from the priesthood and from participating in the higher temple ordinances. And even though this whole ban was based in this erroneous doctrinal thinking about the curse of Cain, it's going to take a revelation in 1978 to overturn this policy. In fact, the Gospel Topics essay says it this way, quote, "Given the long history of withholding the priesthood from men of black African descent, church leaders believed that a revelation from God was needed to alter the policy." And they did. They sought it, and they got it in 1978. Glory, hallelujah. Casey, we did a whole series on this a couple of years ago on race and the priesthood, which we highly recommend you go back and check out. We spent several hours teasing out all of these details. But for today's purposes, all of this is to say that thanks to the great work of trusted historians like Paul Reeve, who we interviewed, we now know that the priesthood temple ban originated squarely within the Utah political debates of 1852. It was all mixed up in the politics of the era, right? Like, it's impossible to separate the two from each other. So knowing the political context helps greatly in understanding the origins of one of the greatest controversies in our church's history.
Yes. The broader political context is really, really helpful in understanding that issue and how it came to be. It just opens up a lot of windows that kind of shed light on the subject. But I'm gonna change directions a little bit and pull back and look at another question, which should be emerging in your mind, listeners, from what we've been talking about. And that is basically, in our time, having a church president run for any public office, let alone the president of the United States, like Joseph Smith did, seems almost unthinkable.
Yeah, even having a prophet serve as a governor, like Brigham Young did, like, seems out of the realm of possibility, right? Mm-hmm. So Casey, so what changed? Like, why don't they do that anymore?
Okay, so that is going to be our primary focus of this episode. But to get there, we're going to skip a few decades from Brigham Young's time to the 1890s, when Utah was finally approaching statehood.
Okay, and we need to make it clear that we're not skipping those decades because nothing politically interesting happened. In fact, a lot did, right?
Yeah. The years of the anti-polygamy crusades by the federal government of the United States against the saints, they are some of the most fascinating years in the history of the church, full stop. No question about that.
Yeah, so we're not skipping it because there's too little to talk about. The truth is there's way too much to talk about in terms of the anti-polygamy crusades. And in fact, they really deserve their own series. I know we've touched on it a little bit, Casey. We did our polygamy series, and we did it last year when we talked about Doctrine and Covenants, Official Declaration 1. We talked about it a little bit, but man, we could do a whole series just on the anti-polygamy crusades, and that would be really enthralling. So maybe we will eventually.
Yeah.
But
we
want to
should
keep our
and
focus. Yeah, but we want to keep our focus today on how the church relationship with politics evolved from those time periods of like, church presidents running for president or being the governor of a state. Like, what happened?
Yeah, so let's just simply summarize the anti-polygamy years by simply saying there were two major political parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats, and neither of them really liked us. But Republicans had a stated goal to end what they called the twin relics of barbarism, which were slavery and polygamy.
Yeah, like the Republican Party was in fact created in part to oppose the practice of polygamy out in Utah. Just kind of let that sink in for a second. The Republican Party, which there's a lot of church members today, Casey, who are part of the Republican Party, it was originally created to stamp out polygamy and slavery. And in terms of slavery, the Republican Party had its hands full during the American Civil War. After their first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected in 1860. But they almost immediately started passing legislation designed to end plural marriage as well during that time out in the Utah Territory among the saints, which leads to a conflict between the saints and the federal government, right?
Yeah, but strangely, in 19th century Utah, the major political divide was not initially between Democrats and Republicans, but between the People's Party and the Liberal Party, organizations that were created around the controversy surrounding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its influence in the territorial government. So let's quickly summarize what these two parties stood for.
Okay, so first, the People's Party was organized in 1870 by Latter-day Saints who felt the need for a political organization that could unite church members regardless of their national party affiliation. Okay, so most Utah settlers had migrated from many different states, right? They carried Democratic or Republican loyalties with them into Utah. But local church/political leaders feared that national party divisions would weaken the local community. So the People's Party, representing the interests of the LDS majority, advocated local self-government and resisted federal intervention in Utah affairs. And it supported church leadership and generally reflected the political preferences of the Latter-day Saint community. Especially early on, actually, the People's Party dominated territorial elections because Latter-day Saints constituted the overwhelming majority of Utah's population. And even though it was often described as the Mormon Party, it did actually include some non-LDS people who supported local control.
Yeah, so that's the People's Party. On the opposing side is the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party emerged the same year as an opposition movement composed primarily of Mormon residents. They called them Gentiles back in the day. So non-Mormon residents, there were also federal appointees because most of the people sent to Utah by the federal government are not Latter-day Saints, and others with non-Latter-day Saint business interests, and the last group, former Latter-day Saints who were critical of church influence. And the Liberal Party argued that the church exercised excessive control over Utah politics, and that church and state should be more clearly separated. So federal anti-polygamy legislation should be enforced in their mind, which was something that obviously Latter-day Saints were opposed to. And this party found its strongest support in mining communities. So you can still sort of see these divisions in Utah culture even today, but places like Park City, were strongholds for the Liberal Party. And in Salt Lake, which has a growing non-Latter-day Saint population, that kind of becomes a stronghold for them too. So the Liberal Party rarely won territory-wide elections, but it was really influential in shaping national perceptions of Utah and lobbying Congress for stronger action against polygamy, and maybe even more important to our story, the political power that the church exercised in territorial Utah.
Yeah, and we should say, too, that in 1870, that same year that the People's Party and the Liberal Party were established, a newspaper was established, which we know today as the Salt Lake Tribune. And it was explicitly created as an alternative voice to challenge they call it the absolute authority of Brigham Young and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was originally actually called the Mormon Tribune. Did you know that, Casey? That's cool.
Yeah, it was started by sort of disaffected Latter-day Saints, which is the story of the Salt Lake Tribune is a whole other episode that we could we could do. But let's stay focused.
Focus. But suffice it to say, it was designed to openly oppose what they viewed as, quote, the undue exercise of priestly authority in Utah. And so for the next several decades, this is established in 1870. And so for the next several decades, the Tribune engages in a fierce, vitriolic media war with the church-owned newspaper called the Deseret News. And some things change, Casey, but some things stay the same. The Tribune will routinely blast polygamy. It'll attack Brigham Young. In fact, they even ran a highly disparaging editorial after he died in 1877. And they're constantly advocating for federal intervention in Utah affairs. So our story today opens in the twilight of both these local parties that had dominated Utah politics for over 20 years at this point. Okay, so by the late 1880s, early 1890s, pressure from national political leaders and the desire for Utah's statehood led both parties to dissolve, actually. Federal officials wanted Utah politics aligned with the national two-party system rather than organized around these local two parties that were all formed around religious identity, right?
Yeah. And several developments sort of accelerate this transition into the two national parties. So first, in 1890, the church issues the Manifesto, also known as Official Declaration 1 in the Doctrine and Covenants, which became the beginning of the end for the practice of plural marriages, new plural marriages. With plural marriage sort of on the wane, there was growing support for Utah statehood. And the possibility that Utah would finally join the Union led national Republican and Democratic leaders to begin encouraging Utahns to join their respective parties. So beginning in 1891, but kind of going for the next 2 or 3 years, the People and Liberal parties were formally abandoned. And Utah voters reorganized along national Republican and Democratic lines. And this realignment helped pave the way for Utah's admission as a state in 1896.
And so that was our narrative bridge to get us to what we want to talk about today, guys. So that was our summary.
It only took 20 minutes to get here. Yeah. But now we're ready to start the story.
We're ready. We're ready.
Don't ever accuse us of not providing context when we're doing it.
Yeah, that's right. So now we're caught up to where our story drops in today. So this is going to be a fun one. It's a real roller coaster, Casey. It involves politics, religion, and opium.
I was wondering when we would finally make it to a story involving opiates. That never really came up when we did the Word of Wisdom. But now this is our chance. This is our time, Scott.
This is it. Today, this is our opium episode, Casey.
Yes. Yeah.
Man. Okay. Now, at the center of what we want to talk about today was one man who, despite his key role in the politics of the time, is actually relatively unknown in the modern church today. And that man is Moses Thatcher. Casey, who is Moses Thatcher?
Okay, so Moses Thatcher was an apostle. He's called to the Quorum of the 12 in 1879. He's long active in Utah politics. He's also serving as a member of the territorial legislature, an advocate for the church in Washington, D.C., a member of the convention that drafted the state constitution for Utah. And for most of his political career, Thatcher was an energetic member of the People's Party. Again, it's sort of like the political arm of the church, which was the dominant force in Utah politics.
But by the 1890s, things were changing, as we said, right? So prior to having Utah achieving statehood, the citizens of Utah were advised to dissolve their territorial parties and affiliate with the national parties, right? And the People's Party was officially ended in 1891. Members made the decision at that point to join either the Republican or Democratic parties. Now, neither of the national political parties were particularly friendly toward the saints, as we mentioned. And remember that Republicans were openly leading a crusade against plural marriage at this time, or they just had, right? That just came on the hills right before the manifesto happened. And so most church members, as you can imagine, gravitated toward the Democratic Party. So Moses Thatcher was one of the most prominent voices to join the Democrats. Just think of this, Casey. A time in our church when the majority of church members were Democrats.
Yes, but counter, a surprising number of Latter-day Saints favored the Republican Party. And among them was a very influential man named Joseph F. Smith, who was in the first presidency and is going to become the president of the church in 1901. And that sort of sets him up for conflict with Moses Thatcher. Now, another big part of the context here was that Thatcher was involved in a business deal over a mine called the Bullion Beck mine that went a little sideways. And he really didn't like how George Q. Cannon, who was another counselor in the first presidency, handled things with the mine. In fact, we actually brought this up in our series on succession. We did a few years back. And in the late 1880s, when President John Taylor was in hiding because of the anti-polygamy laws, George Q. Cannon started to take on a more prominent role, and several of the apostles expressed their displeasure with Cannon having so much power. In fact, Thatcher was one of the leading voices against George Q. Cannon, and he even managed to stir up another young whippersnapper of an apostle named Heber J. Grant.
Yeah, so Thatcher is a little sour on church leadership. And he is particularly fiery in his political speeches at a time when church leaders are trying to get church members to move more into the mainstream, with members now in both political parties.
Yeah. And Thatcher chooses to affiliate with the Democratic Party, and he soon became known for kind of his fiery speeches. So, like in one speech given in 1892, the Ogden Standard Examiner gave a report of an address given by Thatcher where he supposedly declared that Jesus Christ would have been a Democrat and Lucifer would have been a Republican. That's mixing church and state in a really fun way, to be honest with you.
Yeah, okay. And then what's funny is Thatcher then later protested that he had been misquoted. But the first presidency was alarmed at such partisan talk coming from a member of the church hierarchy. So within a few days, a letter appeared in the Ogden Standard Examiner written by Joseph F. Smith, counselor in the first presidency, and John Henry Smith, a member of the 12, protesting the use of Jesus Christ in pursuit of political gain. We should also note that John Henry Smith was specifically working to recruit people into the Republican Party, and that also puts him at odds with Thatcher. So So
interesting. So this causes a lot of controversy. Joseph F. Smith and John Henry Smith wrote an open letter saying that it was inappropriate to invoke this Savior's name in a political setting. And they also went further, accusing Thatcher of aligning Jesus Christ with those who they believed, here's the quote, were accountable for the innocent blood of our murdered kindred, meaning that they believed Democrats were responsible for the deaths of Joseph and Hiram Smith. So,
my word.
That's an interesting argument to say. You can't say Jesus was a Democrat because Democrats killed Joseph and Hiram Smith. This is just sort of showing the growing pains of moving from religion and politics being intermixed to trying to separate them, do church and state.
Yeah. And in the midst of that, Thatcher counters with a letter to the Salt Lake Herald saying that he was only trying to teach that Jesus contended for the right for everyone to use their agency, while Satan did the opposite. He also decried the intense partisan feelings on both sides. But, I mean, as you can imagine, comparing Republicans to Satan didn't really help to cool things down.
It also didn't help that there were already some really strong feelings among members of the 12 about Moses Thatcher. And Thatcher was already considered kind of a firebrand among the leadership of the church. And over the years, he publicly criticized a number of church leaders, including, we mentioned George Q. Cannon, but also Joseph F. Smith, John Henry Smith, Heber J. Grant, Brigham Young Jr., Franklin D. Richards, and Mariner W. Merrill. In fact, in most cases, Thatcher does work to heal the wounds he inflicted, but his relationship with the first presidency and other members of the 12 was tense.
Yeah, and the situation was not helped by Thatcher's poor health. which led to his absence at many meetings of the Quorum of the 12. He's kind of the absentee member of the 12. George Q. Cannon, when he was the first counselor in the first presidency, he privately wrote in 1895 that Thatcher, quote, has not been for a long time in full harmony with his quorum or the presidency. And he worried that Thatcher, quote, would lose the faith unless he repents. So we've got an apostle in trouble, man.
Yeah. So the situation continues to deteriorate until September 1895, when the Utah Democratic Party chose to nominate B.H. Roberts, who's a member of the presidency of the 70, as their candidate for Congress. And Moses Thatcher was nominated as their choice for U.S. senator. So this widens the gulf between Thatcher and the other leaders of the church.
Heber J. Grant, who had declined a possible nomination from the Democratic Party as a gubernatorial candidate, actually felt strongly that Thatcher should not have accepted the nomination, quote, without having had a full and free chat with his brethren of the apostles and also with the first presidency. Like, dude, you should have come and talked to us about this first.
Yeah, so Thatcher is called in after this happens to meet with the first presidency about his actions, and he sort of responds defensively, reproving Wilford Woodruff for trying to dictate in political matters and accusing the presidency of trying to deprive him of his agency. Now, Brigham Young Jr., who was in attendance at the meeting, conceded some of Thatcher's points, but he was alarmed that his fellow apostle would, and these are his words, throw down the responsibilities of his priesthood and pick up politics without consulting the authorities under which he has covenanted to labor. End of quote.
Yeah, and a few days later, during the priesthood session of the October 1895 General Conference, Joseph F. Smith delivers a stern warning to church leaders about entering into political associations without first consulting with their priesthood authorities. Leaders of the Utah Democratic Party interpreted the address from President Smith, who was a Republican, as a rebuke of B.H. Roberts and Moses Thatcher. Now, when the Democrats failed to achieve most of their goals in the November elections, charges began to swirl of church involvement in politics. And you can see this is just messy.
Yeah. And with a growing partisan divide among the leadership of the church, President Woodruff and the other general authorities counseled together in the following months to determine how the church might remedy the situation. So in the meantime, accusations continue to fly back and forth. B.H. Roberts, for instance, was estranged from church leadership for a brief period for his firebrand political speeches, but he eventually relented and reconciled with church leadership.
Yeah, and in the days leading up to the April 1896 General Conference, President Woodruff and his counselors drafted a document which is a big deal. This document became known as the Political Manifesto, in which it directed church authorities, quote, that before accepting any position, political or otherwise, which would interfere with the proper and complete discharge of his ecclesiastical duties, and before accepting a nomination or entering into engagements to perform new duties, said official should apply to the proper authorities and learn from them whether he could, consistent with obligations already entered into with the church upon assuming his office, take upon himself the added duties and labors and responsibilities of the new position. Close quote. Yeah. That's the Political Manifesto.
That's the wording of the Political Manifesto. And here's another part. In the Political Manifesto, church leaders also declared, quote, we do not in the least desire to dictate to them, meaning church officers, concerning their duties as American citizens, or to interfere with the affairs of the state. Neither do we consider that in the remotest degree we are seeking the union of church and state. We once more here repudiate the insinuation that there is or ever has been an attempt by our leading men to trespass upon the ground occupied by the state, or that there has been or is the wish to curtail in any manner any of its functions.
And this document is then signed by all of the general authorities of the church, except for Moses Thatcher. Now, he wasn't present at the meeting when the Political Manifesto was read. But after the meeting, two apostles, Lorenzo Snow and Brigham Young Jr., visited him and asked if he'd be willing to sign it. Thatcher delayed at first, saying that he needed to be more familiar with the document. And then Elders Snow and Young said that they would return that afternoon. And when they did, Thatcher handed them a written statement that read as follows, quote, "There is much of its content that I could conscientiously endorse by signing, but there are other portions which I cannot endorse without stultification." Close quote.
Yeah, and stultification is really one of those words we need to bring back into the common speech.
Yeah, for sure.
Use it in a sentence today, if you can, listeners. I had to look it up, and here's what I found. Stultification means the process of making someone or something stagnant, ineffective, dull, or unable to develop properly. The verb that it's based on is to stultify, which comes from a Latin word that means to make foolish. So take that for what you will. Thatcher felt like it was going to make it unable for him to develop properly, make him ineffective, or to make him look foolish. Because, again, he's a politically ambitious guy, and he felt like, oh, the church doesn't have any right to tell me what to do. In politics, that's not their realm. And the church is saying, we're not trying to interfere in your realm, but it could interfere in your ecclesiastical duties. So you can see how they're kind of at loggerheads here.
Yeah. He felt stultified by the Political Manifesto. So when the afternoon session of General Conference began at 2 p.m., George Q. Cannon, first counselor in the First Presidency, he presents the Political Manifesto to the saints, actually, and Apostle Heber J. Grant read it out loud. Salt Lake Stake president at the time, a guy named Angus M. Cannon, then moved for the manifesto to be adopted, and his first counselor, Joseph E. Taylor, seconded the motion. George Q. Cannon asked if anyone wished to comment, but no one did. The motion was then approved unanimously. Cannon then presented the names of the general authorities for a sustaining vote, leaving one of them off, Casey. Moses Thatcher.
Yep.
Yeah. And once again, the vote was unanimous. So,
yeah.
Oof.
So imagine if this happened in General Conference today. And that's sort of how it plays out. Many people who noticed that Moses Thatcher's name had been left off first thought it was just a mistake. But by evening, news had spread throughout the city that it was no mistake. The omission was intentional. People inside and outside the church had a lot of questions after that. And at first, church leaders said Thatcher hadn't signed the document because he was ill and he was being given time to recover. And that explanation made it sound like his place among the 12 was just only on hold for the present.
In his defense, Moses Thatcher was not the only one who worried about how general authorities might use or abuse the manifesto. Like on April 23rd, 1896, John Henry Smith recorded in his diary that he felt, quote, "Brother Joseph F.'s construction of the manifesto cuts too deep and will cause trouble for our people everywhere," close quote. And politically, John Henry Smith and Thatcher were not on the same side, right? A committed Republican was what Smith was, and he had worked hard to organize the party in Utah after the disbanding of the Mormon People's Party in 1891. He had also personally felt the frustration of Democratic members of the 12 who disapproved of his political involvement. Even still, though, unlike Thatcher, John Henry Smith had signed the Political Manifesto along with the other apostles before it was presented to the church at April conference. So interesting. So he says in his journal that he feels like it cuts too deep. That's his private feelings. But in public, he signed the manifesto anyway.
Yeah,
and went forward with it.
Yeah, and Thatcher does later on offer more clarity on what his objections were to the Political Manifesto. In November 1896, he gives an interview to a Salt Lake Tribune reporter, and he explained that his main objection to the Political Manifesto was that it did not clearly state who was required to consult with the First Presidency before seeking political office. He said, had it named the First Presidency, the 12, and other high officials, and even included the bishops, he said, I should have signed it. Even so, he felt the document contradicted other statements, earlier statements, that had guaranteed the saints complete freedom in political matters. And as an example, he pointed to a declaration issued by the First Presidency on March 18th, 1892, that read, "We have no desire to interfere in these political matters, but proclaim that, as far as we are concerned, the members of the church are entirely and perfectly free in all political matters."
But that didn't really fix things. Again, the months following, President Woodruff and other church leaders attempted to reconcile with Moses Thatcher, but the relationship continued to deteriorate. Thatcher insisted on a public trial if he was to be removed from his ecclesiastical position. When he refused to meet with them privately, the 12 actually voted to remove him from their quorum.
Yeah, and we should note that Thatcher's refusal to sign the Political Manifesto was just one factor in his being removed from the 12. It seems like this one public act just kind of broke the dam on how the First Presidency and the 12 had felt about his troubled attitude in the quorum for the previous few years.
So the church-owned Deseret Evening News on the evening of the 19th of November published a page 4 notice signed by Lorenzo Snow, informing the public that Moses Thatcher had been that day, quote, severed from the council of the 12 apostles, and that he was deprived of his apostleship and other offices in the priesthood. Ooh. And then an unsigned editorial declared, quote, the leaven has been working for a long, long time, and for well nigh half a score of years, this same result might have been feared.
Yeah. So that's from the Deseret News. The next day, which is Friday, the 20th of November, the Salt Lake Tribune on its front page featured a large photograph of Thatcher and a one-word headline, deposed, exclamation point. And the article that accompanied it said that Thatcher reportedly, quote, continued to express his loyalty to the church and its leaders. And although Thatcher allegedly gave no interviews, another newspaper, the Salt Lake Herald, reported that he feels, this is their quote, feels that his action in the premises has been right and that his conscience does not reproach him in the least.
So at this point, Casey, I think a lot of our listeners are wondering, but what does opium have to do with any of this? Where do the opiates come into play?
Yeah, we haven't brought up opium, but we promised we would. So here we go. It's part of the backstory. It's part of the backstory, and it might be a possible reason for us to go a little easy on Moses Thatcher. Apparently, a large part of his estrangement from the First Presidency and the 12 stemmed from some very serious health problems he was dealing with. Several apostles visited him while he was sick, and they prayed for his recovery. In fact, on the 12th of April, 1896, John Henry Smith, who, remember, is kind of his Republican counterpart, who's an apostle, but he's very firmly in favor of Republicans, John Henry Smith spent nearly 2 hours with him. And he later said, he talked quite freely to me about the action in his case, and he also noted that Thatcher seemed like he was in a lot of pain during their conversation.
Yeah, Franklin D. Richards visited him for more than an hour on the 23rd of April, and he said that Thatcher discussed both his physical and mental condition, telling Richards that about 2 weeks earlier he'd become so discouraged that he wished only to die. Early in May, Dr. Parkinson told John Henry Smith that Thatcher is a morphine fiend. He is a morphine fiend, Casey.
Another phrase we need to bring back into the popular consciousness. And so at a meeting with the First Presidency on the 25th of June, 1896, John Henry Smith argued that Thatcher's use of narcotics had impaired his judgment and that he shouldn't be held fully responsible for his actions. And Wilford Woodruff and George Buchanan and several other apostles disagreed, maintaining that Thatcher remained accountable for his actions. Now, in defense of Moses Thatcher, he was apparently suffering intense pain from a bleeding ulcer, and it was common practice for doctors of the time to prescribe opiates to help with the pain. And so he wasn't like sneaking off to dose morphine. He was following his doctor's orders. This was more of a prescription drug problem, is what we would call it today, rather than he was some sort of illicit drug addict or anything like that.
Yeah. the only apostle drug addict in our church's history. Yeah, we're not saying that. Yeah, I had a friend, a fellow religious educator who injured his back in high school, and then in his later years, it was just deeply painful, and so he actually had a morphine pump attached to his back that he could click a little button that would just give him a little dose, and he would joke that he taught religion on drugs. He's like, yeah, I'm doing drugs every day, and I'm in there teaching. I mean, morphine, man, morphine.
Yeah, and chronic pain. I mean, again, this is the equivalent of someone maybe becoming addicted to prescription drugs, and not illegal or illicit drug abuse. We're not accusing Moses Thatcher of that. No, that's not what was happening.
And in fact, he does go to rehab, right? Like he eventually checks into, they call it the Salt Lake Keeley Institute, which was the rehab of its day. And the Keeley Institutes were found throughout the United States. They're founded by this guy named Leslie Keeley, who's a Civil War doctor who worked to help veterans overcome their addictions to alcohol and opiates. Mm-hmm. And knowing about Thatcher's struggles, John Henry Smith urged the other leaders of the church to put off any action against Moses Thatcher until he was in better health.
Yeah. And Ken Godfrey, who's a great historian whose work we're using a lot in this episode, theorized that Thatcher's opium addiction may have been making him more combative and more paranoid than he would have normally been. At the same time, another historian, Ed Lyman, who also did excellent work on Thatcher, argued against this. His theory was that in group meetings with the other apostles, Thatcher felt pressured to conform, but later, when he was away from them by himself, he voiced his objections, and that caused a lot of strife among the quorum. They were used to handling things privately, but Thatcher would always make public declarations, and that sort of understandably upset the rest of the members of the 12 in the first presidency.
Yeah, so whatever the reason, Thatcher was removed from the quorum of the 12 apostles, and that sets up the Political Manifesto as a document with some consequences, Casey. This isn't just an expression of opinion. This has consequences in the church. It effectively establishes the rule that no general church officer would run for political office without consent from the first presidency and the 12. Full stop.
Yeah. And for Moses Thatcher, it seems like political differences with church leaders was just kind of the tip of the iceberg in a split with the higher leadership. He was even briefly considered for excommunication by the presidency of the Salt Lake Stake. The stake presidency brought up 12 charges against him, but they summarized his actions in the last charge by saying, and here's the exact wording, no matter what were his intentions, the effect of his utterances carried on the public mind was that he was fighting the church on a vital question, namely the political liberties of the members of the church, that he was the champion of freedom as against the chains which the church was forging to bind them. Brother Thatcher fostered the idea that his brethren of the 12, or some of them at least, were his enemies and that they deemed to do him injury.
And in reply to these charges, Moses Thatcher sought a reconciliation. He wrote a short letter to the stake presidency less than 24 hours after he was informed of the charges. And here's what he wrote, quote, having repeatedly affirmed willingness to make amends where I have wronged my brethren in public utterances or otherwise, while under misapprehensions as to the true situation, and as you have informed me that I do this by accepting your decision, and as the course would prevent arguments and disputes as to whether I have complied in full with all requirements, I make the decision, just as you rendered, and I authorize you to make it public in any manner you may here deem proper. So you can publicly let people know where I stand on this.
Yeah. And when the stake presidency receives Thatcher's letter, they issued a statement saying that what he had said was satisfactory and that he could keep his church membership and his priesthood, though he wasn't allowed to use the priesthood. And Thatcher, for his part, said he was free politically and could accept the declaration of principle, as he called it, without, here's the word again, stultifying himself.
Without stultifying himself. Now, of course, the day after the church court's decision, a Salt Lake Tribune reporter interviewed Thatcher briefly, in which he said that he had been visited by several unnamed general authorities and was getting ready to leave for Logan. "I am glad," he said. "It is all over. I am as free as ever and have not violated any of the party pledges which I have made in the past. And as to my soliciting the forgiveness of my brethren, I have always said that I would make amends if it could be shown that I had wronged them." So I feel like there's still a little bit of spice there, right? Like, if they can prove that I wronged them, then I will apologize.
Yeah. But this does represent a significant change in his attitude. And we might ask the question of, well, what changes? He's openly, publicly defiant, and then he sort of backs down. Well, a couple things. By the fall of 1897, it seems like he was in better health. He also may have received assurances from church leaders that the Political Manifesto only referred to general authorities. See, it seems like one of his major concerns was that nearly all men in the church were part of the priesthood. And that would mean that no one could run for public office without getting permission from the first presidency. And finally, it appears that some friends of his, B.H. Roberts is the name that stands out here, they talked to him and helped him see that his priorities should be his faith and not his politics.
And further, in his defense, Thatcher remains a faithful Latter-day Saint until the end of his life. He was still a popular politician. He was actually elected to the United States Senate by the state legislature in 1899. Things worked differently in Senate elections back then. But Thatcher declined because he thought being a polygamist and serving in the U.S. Senate would bring too much negative attention to the church. He was right about that. And later events, when B.H. Roberts and Reed Smoot ran for the U.S. House and Senate, proved that he was in fact wise in his judgments there. That was the case.
Yeah, and speaking of Reed Smoot, when public hearings were held to try and prevent him, Reed Smoot's another apostle. He wins election to the U.S. Senate, and it's a national scandal. We're going to talk about it in a couple episodes. There's hearings held to try and prevent him from being seated in the U.S. Senate, and during those hearings, Moses Thatcher is called to testify. Now, if he had been embittered against the leadership of the church, here's a chance to embarrass the church on the national stage. And Thatcher goes to Washington. He testifies before the committee in April of 1904. And during the first day of his hearings, he spent much of his time answering questions about his history in the church and revisiting the friction he had experienced with other senior church leaders. In fact, there's a pamphlet by Rena Soner called Church and State that was entered into the record along with other documents related to Thatcher's dispute with general authorities over the Political Manifesto. So he's got the microphone. This is a nationally broadcast. If he wants to blast the church, this is when he can do it.
So what does he say? Well, Thatcher tells the senators that he would not have reconciled with church leaders unless he had been assured that he was, quote, absolutely free as an American citizen to exercise his rights as such. And then he goes on to say that the manifesto applied only to high-ranking church authorities. And he added that if the manifesto had been interpreted that way in April of 1896, he would have signed it along with the other apostles.
Yeah. And Thatcher also testified that he did not believe the church officially endorsed or opposed political candidates. Earlier witnesses had spent a great deal of time arguing that the temple endowment, for instance, included an oath of vengeance for the death of Joseph Smith that conflicted with a senator's oath to uphold the Constitution. And Thatcher outright rejects that claim and insisted that nothing in Mormon temple worship was incompatible with the American political system.
Yeah, and then as he concluded his testimony, Thatcher emphasized the importance of both religious faith and civic loyalty. Here's what he said, quote, I have never experienced a moment in my life since I reached mature years when I did not feel that if I was not free, I would go where I could be free. For while my allegiance to God is very high, I hold that a man must give his allegiance as well to country. That has been my position. Close quote.
Yeah, so given the opportunity to embarrass the church, he really backs down and gives this, defense of the church, saying he doesn't see any real conflict. And like we mentioned, he remains a faithful Latter-day Saint to the last day of his life. He dies in August of 1909, and newspapers all over the country ran reports and tributes showing just how widely known he was. And his longtime friend, who was also a Democrat, B.H. Roberts, and his relative and Republican friend, this is Apostle John Henry Smith, spoke at his funeral in the Logan Tabernacle, which Thatcher had also helped build. The building was actually too small for everyone who came to pay their respects to this former apostle. And today he's buried in the Logan City Cemetery, and he remains one of the most fascinating figures in the history of the church.
Yeah, not without his controversies.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's back up and let me ask a question. So how does this story fit into the larger story of Latter-day Saints in politics? I'll just take a first swing at this. The Political Manifesto was an important benchmark in the integration of the church into American society, is how I want to say it. The document was taken to all the congregations in the church and put forth for a sustaining vote. And during this process, further clarifications were offered on the policy, clarifying that only general authorities needed to consult with church leaders before seeking political office, not rank and file members of the church. And so that's a huge benchmark in the church, Casey.
Yeah. And over the years, it was applied in a number of different ways. For instance, in 1934, J. Reuben Clark, who's the second counselor in the first presidency, was suggested as a candidate for the U.S. Senate. Before he accepts any nomination, President Clark consulted with President Heber J. Grant, and then ultimately he decided to not run in the election. And a few years later, when Ezra Taft Benson, who's also a member of the Quorum of the 12, was asked to serve as Secretary of Agriculture by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, he goes and consults with President David O. McKay, who gave him clearance, and then he serves as Secretary of Agriculture for the duration of the Eisenhower administration.
And we're going to talk more about that in another episode. But
yeah, that's a future episode.
I just want to say, I don't see church members today. It doesn't even cross our minds almost to nominate members of the 12 or First Presidency for office. Almost in our minds, it's so separated, right? It's almost unheard of for a general authority to hold a political office while he's serving in his calling. We often think of people being called from political or their professional place into full-time service as a general authority. And so I think for the modern Latter-day Saint mind, it's a little out there, Casey, but our past shows that it has been very integrated, and it's this Political Manifesto that kind of helped, make this standard policy in the church. Not that it's impossible, but that it does need to come with clearance from the First Presidency in 12 if you're a general authority and you want to run for office, or if you're being asked by the President of the United States to serve in his cabinet, as happened with Ezra Taft Benson. And so I think that really well, I think that explains the decrease in political involvement while serving in office as a general authority.
Yeah, and I got to be honest. There are still moments when I look at church leaders and say, "Oh, I wish that person would run for office." The most recent was during the special Fifth Sunday back in May, when we watched the video where D. Todd Christofferson and Quentin L. Cook had a big discussion about the Constitution. And I remember watching it and thinking, oh gosh, I wish that our political leaders would sit down and have conversations like this. And maybe that's just impossible in the current partisan environment, but I would love it if they did. But it just doesn't seem like it's happening right now. And I got to admit too, that if Quentin L. Cook suddenly said, "Hey, I'm running for U.S. Senate," it would be weird. And I would feel strange about it. But that's because, we're over 120 years removed from Moses Thatcher and what was going on. Moses Thatcher's time, I think he was like, why can't I be an apostle and serve in politics? And it seems like
at the same time,
be a senator at the same time, which Reed Smoot does do for almost 30 years in the early 20th century. Just seems like that's not something that would happen today. We've kind of moved past that.
It would come across weird, but it would be so cool if Elder Cook ran for office or President Christopherson, bro.
Yeah.
I don't want to show my politics too much here, Casey, but they would have my vote.
They'd have your vote and mine as well. Okay, well, before we end, I just want to acknowledge the great work done on Moses Thatcher and the Political Manifesto by giving a shout out to two great historians, Ken Godfrey and Edward Leo Lyman. In fact, I knew Ken Godfrey really well. We worked together on the History of Seminaries and Institutes that came out a couple of years ago, and he was always just so generous and so kind in his work. And I know Ed Lyman too. I've met him at MHA. He is a fellow Millard County boy. We both grew up in the same place. In fact, he wrote the history of Millard County, and I want to acknowledge him. So you can find a more detailed breakdown of what we talked about in their two articles. The article by Ken Godfrey is called Moses Thatcher in the Dock: His Trials, the Aftermath, and His Last Days, which was in the Journal of Mormon History, Volume 24, Number 1, in 1998. And Ed Lyman's article is called The Alienation of an Apostle from His Quorum, the Moses Thatcher Case, which was in Dialogue, Volume 18, Number 2. You can find both of these online pretty easily. I'm just saying Moses Thatcher deserves way more attention than he gets, because it's such an interesting story, and it's one of those key transition points that we don't always appreciate because it's sort of a political story and not an ecclesiastical story. But I also, think Moses Thatcher ended in a good place. Like, I see him as an inspirational figure. Like, he was kind of cantankerous, but he also seemed like a really principled guy. And I think in the end, all the apostles admired that, as much as it seems like he wasn't always the most pleasant person to be around.
Now, let's just end with this today. The Moses Thatcher story is kind of the first in a trilogy that we're going to do here. So he's number one. The two other figures we need to talk about are B.H. Roberts and Reed Smoot. We've mentioned them both in today's episode, but we need to do a full episode deep dive on each of them. They both do a lot of work toward allowing Latter-day Saints to break into national politics. And so that's where we're going to pick up the story in our next episode.
Yep. First venture into national politics, then B.H. Roberts and Reed Smoot. And it's hard to overstate how important what happened to those two individuals was in bringing Latter-day Saints into the mainstream of national politics, wherever they are, but especially the United States.
Yeah, 100%. So we'll look forward to that, Casey. We'll see you in our next episode.
Okay, I'll see you then.